This triumph demonstrates we made the correct decision by dismissing the unqualified personnel, Eric Rhodes proclaimed from the podium, his voice resonating throughout the opulent ballroom of the Sovereign Plaza in Denver, Colorado. A wave of applause swept through the attendees, champagne goblets clinking in honor of our biopharmaceutical firm's latest wonder drug. I was positioned in a discreet corner, watching the individual who had dismantled my career revel in a triumph built on deceit. My name is Adelaide Cormack, and I am 49 years old. For 11 years, I had been the foundation of regulatory oversight at Viridian Dynamics, making certain every clinical study, every safety protocol, and every document sent to the Food and Drug Administration adhered to the most rigorous standards. My job was to spot mistakes before they spiraled into catastrophes, to challenge data that appeared too flawless, and to ensure our company conducted itself with honor. But I discovered that integrity wasn't a quality Eric Rhodes prized when he took over as our new Chief Executive Officer 8 months ago. This evening's gala was intended to honor the approval of Clarionics, a groundbreaking therapy for autoimmune conditions. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, and Denver's influential figures drifted among showcases detailing our company's evolution from a fledgling startup to a biopharmaceutical giant. The guest list was a who's who: financiers, board directors, healthcare experts, and reporters, chronicling what they assumed was a landmark achievement in modern science. The reality they were unaware of was that the achievement they were celebrating was constructed upon doctored trial results, concealed adverse effects, and counterfeit compliance paperwork. I was certain because I had unearthed it, catalogued it, and fought desperately to prevent it. My alerts had been brushed aside, my apprehensions classified as alarmism, and my role dissolved under the pretext of corporate reorganization. Eric's gaze met mine across the bustling room, and his grin broadened with a cruel sense of pleasure. He lifted his goblet higher, his voice laced with that familiar, patronizing tone I had learned to loathe. To all who recognize that advancement demands audacious leadership, not the hesitant whispers of the past that prefer to see progress constrained by over-the-top caution. The attendees cheered once more, oblivious that their festive gathering was on the verge of becoming a crime scene. I repositioned the silver briefcase on my lap, conscious of the weight of 11 years of precise record-keeping. Each audio file, each altered report, every shred of proof that would demolish Eric's empire of lies, was securely contained within. As I observed him carry on with his speech about foresight and bravery, I couldn't help but ponder how this night might have unfolded differently had he just heeded my warnings. Instead, my silencing had been his chosen course of action, casting me as a barrier to innovation. Tonight, he was about to find out that some barriers cannot be bypassed. They can only expose the reality that lies hidden beneath. The journey that brought me to this point started last September, when Eric Rhodes entered our humble offices near Lodo with his high-end suits and even grander aspirations. Viridian Dynamics had always been a close-knit company, established 25 years ago by Dr. Annalise Viridian, with the goal of creating safe, effective therapies for uncommon illnesses. Upon her retirement, Dr. Viridian had personally selected Eric, swayed by his stellar reputation at larger biopharmaceutical firms, confident he could elevate us to new heights. I recall our initial all-hands meeting with clarity. Eric stood at the front of our compact conference room, his demeanor instantly capturing everyone's focus. His dark hair was immaculately coiffed, his suit was impeccably tailored, and his smile exuded the type of assurance that persuades investors to sign checks. "We are going to transform this sector," he declared, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "The old methods are too sluggish, too timid. We must act quicker, dream bigger, and embrace calculated risks." Initially, his zeal was contagious. The whole team felt invigorated by his plans for swift expansion and market dominance. Our labs were abuzz with activity on new projects, and capital poured in from financiers keen to invest in what Eric dubbed the next biopharmaceutical sensation. Even I felt a guarded optimism about the new direction he was setting, but as the weeks stretched into months, I started to perceive unsettling trends in the data emerging from our clinical trials for Clarionics. Patient success rates appeared extraordinarily high, adverse effects unusually scarce, and project timelines unnaturally compressed. When I expressed these apprehensions in our monthly oversight meetings, Eric would brush them off with a dismissive gesture and a condescending smile. "Adelaide, I value your thoroughness, but we can't allow the quest for perfection to hinder our progress," he would state, his tone suggesting my worries were both baseless and unwelcome. "These findings aren't questionable. They're extraordinary. Sometimes revolutionary therapies yield revolutionary outcomes." My rapport with Eric's inner circle was just as tense. His newly appointed vice president of clinical development, Preston Cole, regarded me as an obsolete figure from a past age of pharmaceutical research. In team discussions, he would roll his eyes when I brought up protocol compliance or regulatory mandates, frequently cutting in with remarks about updating our methods and simplifying archaic procedures. The final straw came in February, when I found irregularities in our safety data that could not be attributed to standard statistical variance. Patients who had suffered severe adverse events were inexplicably missing from our formal reports, while others exhibited recovery curves that strained medical credibility. When I showed this proof to Eric and called for a comprehensive audit of our trial data, his reaction was immediate and firm. My role was being cut due to budget cuts and an operational overhaul. The moment I grasped the complete extent of Eric's deceit arrived 3 weeks after I was let go, when I got an unforeseen call from Isabella Moreno, a former co-worker who had also been laid off in the restructuring. We convened at a mellow coffee shop in the Highlands neighborhood, well away from the corporate headquarters where we had once worked together. "Adelaide, I couldn't keep quiet any longer," Isabella murmured, casting nervous looks around before pushing a manila folder across the small table. "After you were fired, it became much worse. So much worse." Inside the folder were copies of internal communications that sent a chill down my spine. The papers laid bare a methodical campaign to tamper with clinical trial data, suppress negative patient outcomes, and forge the compliance paperwork submitted to government agencies. Patient ID codes had been changed, unfavorable results purged from the system, and safety summaries rewritten to erase any reference to serious side effects. The most conclusive proof was a signed directive from Eric himself, dated just 2 weeks prior, explicitly ordering his department heads to refine the data presentation for the upcoming Food and Drug Administration assessment. The wording was meticulously chosen to allow for legal wiggle room, but the message was clear. Viridian Dynamics was deliberately providing false information to secure approval for a drug that failed to meet safety requirements. They warned they'd ruin my career if I came forward, Isabella added, her voice a mere whisper against the coffee shop's background hum. "But what they're doing is more than just unethical. It's illegal. People could be killed by this drug, Adelaide. Real people with lives and futures." That evening, I sat in my modest apartment with a view of the Rocky Mountains, gazing at the evidence laid out on my kitchen table. The Denver skyline shimmered in the distance, but I felt only an encroaching darkness. For 11 years, I had poured my life into guaranteeing pharmaceutical safety, trusting that my efforts shielded vulnerable patients from precisely this sort of corporate wrongdoing. Now, I was confronted with a decision that would shape not just my own future, but possibly the futures of innumerable patients who would be prescribed Clarionics. I reflected on my own father, who passed away from complications of an experimental cancer drug that was fast-tracked to market without adequate safety reviews. I remembered squeezing his hand in the hospital as he endured side effects that might have been avoided if someone, anyone, had dared to speak the truth to those in power. I chose a career in compliance to honor him, to ensure no other family would suffer as we had. The choice became starkly, painfully obvious. I would not let Eric Rhodes transform Viridian Dynamics into a company that put profits before patient well-being. If he sought to silence me with a pink slip, I would counter with something infinitely more potent than any company memo or job review. I would gather every piece of evidence, every falsified summary, every forged paper into an undeniable case that would lead federal agents to his doorstep. The briefcase belonged to my grandfather, a silver-plated attaché he used during his time as a government auditor. Tonight, it would hold the truth that Eric had worked so hard to conceal. Over the subsequent 4 months, I morphed from an out-of-work compliance officer into something akin to a private detective, leveraging my 11 years of professional connections and deep familiarity with Viridian's internal operations. I started to methodically gather evidence on every facet of Eric's corrupt scheme. My initial success came via Mei Lin, a lab technician who had been spared during the corporate downsizing, but was profoundly disturbed by what she'd seen. We met at Union Station on a drizzly Thursday morning, blending into the crowd of commuters and travelers as she recounted her experiences. They had us redo experiments until the results matched what they wanted, May explained, her voice thick with regret as we passed by the bustling train platforms. When patient 247 died of liver failure during the study, Preston Cole instructed us to reclassify the death as unrelated to the drug. He claimed the patient had an undiagnosed pre-existing illness. "Did you save any documentation of the initial test results?" I inquired, striving to sound nonchalant despite my pounding heart. May nodded slowly, retrieving a small flash drive from her handbag. I made copies of everything before they forced us to erase the originals. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared of being fired. My daughter starts college next year. The flash drive was a goldmine of proof. Original lab reports detailing severe adverse reactions, internal emails outlining data manipulation tactics, and video footage of meetings where Eric and Preston openly discussed falsifying safety information. One especially incriminating video caught Eric stating, "The Food and Drug Administration auditors won't grasp what they're seeing. If we frame the data properly, we just need to accentuate the positives and obscure the negatives within the statistical clutter." As I pressed further with my investigation, I found that the deception went far beyond mere data tampering. Eric had established a whole parallel reporting structure, keeping 2 separate sets of records, one for internal review that reflected the actual trial outcomes, and another for regulatory filings that depicted Clarinix as a miracle drug with negligible side effects. The extent of the fraud was shocking. Of the 300 patients in the clinical trials, 47 had suffered serious adverse reactions, including 12 who required hospitalization and 3 who died. None of these incidents were documented in the official reports sent to federal authorities. Instead, these patients had been retroactively scrubbed from the study using various procedural tricks, their ordeal erased from the official record as if it had never occurred. My inquiries uncovered another unsettling trend. Eric had systematically ousted or neutralized anyone who could challenge his deception. Besides Isabella and me, 5 other veteran employees had been fired or transferred to roles where they would be cut off from clinical data. The signal was unmistakable: defy the official story and suffer professional ruin. The evidence I was compiling depicted an organization that was thoroughly rotten from the highest levels down. Eric had surrounded himself with ambitious people who were ready to engage in fraud for the sake of career progression and monetary gain. Preston Cole had been given a substantial raise and stock options for his complicity, while other managers had been offered promotions based on their silence about the data anomalies. But I also found something that gave me optimism. Not everyone at Viridian was a party to Eric's scheme. A number of employees had maintained their own logs of questionable events, forming a quiet network of documentation that ran alongside the official company records. They were too afraid to act alone, but their combined evidence formed an airtight case against Eric's corrupt enterprise. As the launch gala drew near, I knew I had gathered sufficient proof, not only to unmask Eric's offenses, but also to guarantee he would face severe federal prosecution for jeopardizing public safety and deceiving regulatory bodies. The weeks before the launch gala were a peculiar mix of eager anticipation and deep anxiety. I observed from a distance as Eric's PR machine promoted Clarionics as a groundbreaking innovation that would revolutionize treatment for millions of patients with autoimmune diseases. Medical journals ran effusive articles on the drug's effectiveness. Investment banks advised buying Viridian stock, and patient advocacy organizations lauded the company for creating a therapy that offered hope where there had been none. What made the whole affair even more tragic was that Clarionics might have been a truly legitimate breakthrough if Eric had just permitted the clinical trials to run their course honestly. The foundational science was solid, and early results indicated the drug could offer substantial relief to many patients. But Eric's impatience and avarice had tainted the development process, creating a scenario where a potentially life-saving drug had turned into a lethal lottery for unwitting patients. During this period, I also uncovered more about Eric's personal driving forces. Through discussions with ex-colleagues and research into his professional history, I found out he was under immense pressure from investors who had supplied capital based on aggressive schedules and profit forecasts. His prior pharmaceutical venture had failed to get a major drug to market, tarnishing his reputation in a way that only a spectacular win at Viridian could fix. The inquiry also showed that Eric's fraudulent behavior wasn't limited to Clarionics. He had been inflating R&D expenses to secure larger investor buy-ins, while simultaneously downplaying potential liability risks in the company's financial disclosures. The Securities and Exchange Commission would surely be keen to inspect Viridian's accounting once federal agents started probing the company's activities. 3 days before the gala, I had an unexpected guest at my apartment. Isabella Moreno was at my door, looking wan and terrified, holding a small duffel bag, as though she was about to skip town. "Adelaide, they know we've been collecting evidence," she said, rushing past me into the apartment. "Preston Cole cornered me yesterday. He asked very specific questions about documents I couldn't possibly know about, unless someone had passed them to me." My stomach dropped as I grasped that our investigation might have been compromised. "What did he say, exactly?" "He brought up specific patient IDs and test results that were only on the files May gave us. He's obviously been tracking who's accessing what. I think we're all at risk of being accused of corporate espionage or stealing company secrets." This development compelled me to drastically move up my schedule. My initial plan was to hand over my evidence to the authorities after the launch gala, in the hope of collecting more proof during the event. But if Eric's team was now monitoring us, any delay could lead to the evidence being hidden or eradicated. That evening, I reached out to Agent Anya Sharma at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Denver field office. Using a mutual acquaintance in federal law enforcement, I set up a secure meeting to present my initial discoveries and ask for official protection for the witnesses who had risked their livelihoods to reveal the truth. Agent Sharma was a veteran agent with deep expertise in pharmaceutical fraud investigations. After examining just a fraction of my evidence, she verified my suspicions. Viridian Dynamics was involved in numerous federal offenses, including deceiving regulatory bodies, endangering public welfare, and securities fraud. Mr. Rhodes and his team are facing significant jail time if we can substantiate these claims in court, Agent Sharma stated during our meeting. But we have to be smart about how we handle this. If they get wind that they're being investigated, they might shred evidence or try to leave the country. We decided the launch gala would be the ideal setting to collect more evidence, while keeping key suspects confined to one place for a possible arrest. The night before the gala, I sat in my apartment putting together the final elements of what I had started calling my insurance policy. The silver briefcase held more than just paperwork. It symbolized 11 years of commitment to pharmaceutical safety, the memory of my father who died from poorly tested drugs, and the belief that future patients deserve protection from corporate greed. Inside the briefcase, I had sorted the evidence into 3 clear sections. The first part contained verified proof of falsified clinical trial data, with before and after versions of safety summaries that starkly illustrated how adverse events had been systematically purged from official records. The second part contained audio recordings of internal meetings, where Eric and Preston openly discussed methods for misleading federal regulators, including the damning exchange, where Eric called FDA auditors pen pushers who wouldn't know true innovation if it hit them in the face. The third section was likely the most damning: financial documents detailing how Eric had manipulated research funds and safety budgets to feign regulatory compliance, while, in reality, taking shortcuts that endangered patient lives. These papers showed that Viridian had allocated less than half the industry average to safety oversight, while assuring investors they were surpassing regulatory standards. I had also included a comprehensive timeline illustrating how Eric had systematically dismissed or silenced employees who expressed safety worries, establishing a pattern of obstruction that would be highly compelling to federal prosecutors. The timeline featured termination notices, transfer memos, and even recorded conversations where Preston Cole had threatened employees with career obliteration if they persisted in challenging the official data. As I secured the briefcase for the last time, I thought about how profoundly my life had shifted since Eric's arrival at Viridian. 8 months prior, I was a well-regarded compliance officer with a stable career and a strong sense of mission. Tonight, I was effectively a whistleblower, on the verge of taking down a company that was once my professional sanctuary, aware that my actions would probably spell the end of my career in the pharmaceutical field. But I also knew that remaining silent was not a choice. The evidence I had amassed demonstrated that Clarionyx would almost certainly cause grave harm to patients who believed the drug was properly tested and sanctioned. Some of those patients could die from side effects that Viridian was aware of, but had concealed from authorities. Others might sustain lifelong injuries that could have been avoided had the clinical trials been run with integrity. The launch gala itself had morphed into a macabre festival of scientific deceit, disguised as a medical triumph. News organizations were already broadcasting stories about Clarionyx's capacity to revolutionize autoimmune therapy. Patient advocacy groups were commending Viridian's dedication to innovation, and investors were inflating the company's stock value based on forecasts that presumed the drug would dominate a large segment of the autoimmune disease market. Agent Sharma had deployed federal agents throughout the Sovereign Plaza, posing as banquet staff, security guards, and even reporters covering the gala. The strategy was straightforward. I would hand the evidence to Eric in plain sight of all the guests, creating a public record of the transfer that would be hard for him to refute or conceal. The moment he took the briefcase, federal agents would swoop in to secure the proof and take key suspects into custody. As I got ready to head to the hotel, I imagined the moment Eric would grasp that his meticulously built illusion was on the brink of shattering. For months, He had viewed me as a nuisance to be brushed aside, an annoyance to be dismissed and erased. Tonight, he would find out that some nuisances cast very long shadows. The Sovereign Plaza's ballroom was a symphony of triumph and self-praise. When I walked in at precisely 8 p.m., Denver's biopharmaceutical luminaries circulated under crystal chandeliers, their talk accented by the soft chime of champagne goblets and the gentle strains of a string quartet. Waitstaff in starched white jackets moved about with trays of canapes, while a photographer documented what everyone assumed would be landmark moments in medical science. Eric was the center of attention, magnificent in a flawlessly tailored black tuxedo, his smile beaming as he greeted investors and posed for photos with esteemed medical experts. A massive banner proclaiming Clarionyx, the future of autoimmune therapy, was draped behind the stage, where he would shortly give his triumphant speech. I navigated the crowd at a slow pace, my silver briefcase attracting inquisitive looks from attendees who remembered me, despite my recent dismissal. A few ex-colleagues approached with stilted pleasantries, evidently uneasy with my presence, but not knowing how to broach the topic. I offered polite smiles and fitting replies, all the while keeping my focus on Eric's location and the federal agents I knew were scattered around the room. When Eric finally ascended the stage at 9:15 p.m., a hush fell over the room. The lights dimmed, leaving a single spotlight on him, like a stage actor preparing for the performance of his career. He opened with a gracious nod to investors and employees, his voice imbued with the self-assured cadence of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone of consequence. Tonight signifies the culmination of years of tireless research and development, he declared, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with rehearsed command. Clarionyx embodies all that we champion at Viridian Dynamics: scientific brilliance, regulatory honesty, and an unyielding dedication to patient safety. The hypocrisy of his words was nearly suffocating as I readied myself to rise and offer my final contribution to Viridian Dynamics' legacy. This triumph demonstrates we made the correct decision by dismissing the unqualified personnel, Eric went on, his voice swelling with victorious confidence as the crowd burst into fervent applause. His eyes met mine at the rear of the ballroom, and his smile broadened with undeniable spite. To all who recognize that advancement demands audacious leadership, not the hesitant whispers of the past that prefer to see progress constrained by over-the-top caution. The crowd cheered once more, utterly ignorant that they were saluting the ousting of the very individual who had tried to shield them from pharmaceutical deception. Eric lifted his champagne goblet higher, his face radiating the contentment of someone who was certain he had neutralized every threat to his intricate fabrication. That was my cue. I rose deliberately, my silver briefcase glinting in the ballroom's sophisticated light as conversations tapered off and heads swiveled my way. The atmosphere in the room changed palpably as guests identified the woman who had been publicly shamed and professionally ruined by the man they were lionizing. Eric's expression morphed from victorious to baffled to something nearing dread as I started walking purposefully toward the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," I stated, my voice projecting clearly through the now silent ballroom, "I have a final contribution to make to Viridian Dynamics." The crowd split to let me pass, their expressions a blend of intrigue and nervous expectation. Eric stood motionless at the lectern, his champagne goblet frozen midway to his mouth, as I ascended the steps to the stage. With deliberate steps, positioning myself directly before him, I presented the briefcase that held 11 years of pharmaceutical compliance knowledge and 4 months of intensive investigation. "Here is my final contribution," I said evenly, my voice echoing through the sound system that had just been broadcasting his false victory speech. Eric's hand quivered slightly as he took the briefcase, his eyes scanning mine for a clue as to what was about to happen, but I just spun around and walked away, my heels clicking on the marble floor as I made for the ballroom's exit, certain that federal agents were already moving in. Behind me, I could hear the baffled murmur of voices as Eric attempted to salvage his celebration, oblivious that his entire world was on the verge of collapsing with absolute finality. As I stepped out into the crisp Denver night, I knew that revenge was never the real goal. It was always about safeguarding the patients who trusted that someone, somewhere, was making sure their medicines were safe. In dismantling Eric's empire of lies, I had not only recovered my professional integrity, but also honored my father's memory and my own sense of purpose, in a world where choosing the right path often exacts the steepest personal price.